This is an interview with Dr. Horace Huntley for the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute's Oral History Project. Dr. Huntley is the director of the Oral History Project here at the Institute. The interview will be conducted by Keisha Leitner and Eric Watson. Today is May 26, 1998, and we are currently at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. First, we would like to thank you, Dr. Huntley, for taking time out of your busy schedule and talking with us.
Thank you.
First, we're going to ask you a pretty general question. Where were you born?
I was born here in Birmingham. In fact, I was born at the was now a University Hospital. Then it was the Hillman Hospital.
Oh, okay.
And, born in 1942. It was in, of course, the height of the segregationist era. And Black people were not allowed to come in the front door. That day, December 5th, 1942, both my grandmothers actually walked into the front door of the Hillman Hospital. And they decided, it said that this was a new day and they were simply not going to go around and back that day.
Oh, so they pretty much started the desegregation movement.
They started in 1942 on December 5th, so we celebrate that every December 5th.
And what community were you raised in?
In the Riley community, which is in the southwestern community, about a mile southwest of Powderly.
And exactly what type of job did the people engage in that community?
Well, I actually lived on a dead-end street. And on my street, there were mostly just working class people. Now, I lived with my grandmother, who was a domestic. My mother, who was a licensed practical nurse. And I lived with, there were three of us, my brother and sister, and then there were two first cousins. So another aunt, she didn't live there, but her children lived with us, and she worked out of town. And she would go back and forth between Birmingham and Hale County. She taught in Hale County. So our family was more or less, teachers, nurses. My uncle he was a mechanic. He repaired cars, and other people on the street were steel workers. There was a steel worker. There was a miner. I don't know what was I'm not sure. But in the bigger, wider community, there were other people who were teachers, there were ministers. Most of the people in my community, though, were domestics, just like my grandmother.
Okay. Now, you mentioned your mother was an LPN.
Right.
What type of educational background did your father have?
My father was a welder. He had a high school education. My mother and father were divorced very early. I never remember them living together. So before I started first grade, they were separated. I'm not sure whether they were divorced at the time. So then I was raised by my grandmother and my mother. And it was rather interesting because he moved to Michigan. And the reason that he did is because he worked in the mine after he got out of the Navy. He went to the Navy. He worked in the mine. And in the mine, in the mid to late 40s, again, this is Birmingham, Alabama, he had a dispute with a white worker, and he beat this man up. About 4 o'clock in the morning, I was told that the police came to the house, arrested him, and took him to the Brownville jail. And Brownville is a little place just southwest of Raleigh. And that's where his folk lived, and that's where he and my mother were living at the time with his folk. My grandfather was a member of the International Union of Mine Mill and Smelter Workers, and he had very little education. But someone told him that they'd come and picked his son up and taken him to jail. And he said to them, well, they can't do anything with that boy until they get hearing from across the water. And everybody wants to know what that meant, you know. And the only thing I could figure it meant was that he was a member of the International Union. So he figured the union was gonna handle it. They wouldn't harm him or anything, but the Klan told my father that he had to get out of town. They were going to do something to him. So as a result, that was part of why he then left and went to Michigan. And my mother went and spent some time, but as a result of that, they never really made it. She came back home to Birmingham.
Now, what company did your father work for?
It was U.S. Steel, TCI at the time,
Mm-hmm.
Tennessee Coal Iron. And he was an iron ore miner initially for a brief time after getting out of the military. And he was following really the footsteps of his father. My grandfather was an iron ore miner. But then when he went to Michigan, he went to work for General Motors, and he became a welder.
And your parents were both born and raised in Birmingham? Or?
No, my mother was born in Tuscaloosa, but raised in Birmingham.
Mm-hmm.
My father was born in Birmingham and raised here in Birmingham.
Now, you mentioned a brother and a sister. Is that the only makeup of your siblings? And if so,
Yeah.
what line do you fall in?
I was the oldest.
Mm-hmm.
I am the oldest. My brother's next and my sister's the baby. And they both still live here in Birmingham.
And your grandmother, you mentioned her, and I understand she's probably a pretty forceful lady. Just give her a chance. What was her education background?
Mama could not read or write. She was illiterate.
Mm-hmm.
But she was the smartest person I ever known. She was my hero. Well, you know, in black families, there was always discussions of color. And in my family, my grandmother and I were the darkest in the family. Everybody else was light skinned. So they would always tease me about being black, but they were doing that in order to make me feel good about myself, you know. But they would always say that you and Mama are the blackest ones in the family. And you're not light skinned like we are, you know. But they were really using reverse psychology, my aunt particularly, you know. And that was always very interesting because I would always say, well, Mama knows everything. So I look just like Mama. And so I was proud of that.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, as I said, Mama couldn't read. She couldn't read her name. When the mailman would come and you'd have to sign, I would sign for her and read it to her. But I remember as we were growing up, she would always read to us every night. We thought she was reading. She would get a book every night, and before we go to bed, she would read. And one night, my mother came home early or something, so she was going to read to us. So she got the same book that Mama was reading. She read. We said, oh, no, that's not right. Mama didn't say that, you know. So we always had a big laugh out of that. But my grandmother, she was the matriarch of the family on my mother's side. And she always said that she wanted her children to go to school because she didn't want them working in no white folks' kitchen.
Okay, well, you pretty much set the pace for my next question. What was your first contact with blacks? I know you mentioned your father had a run, well, not with blacks, with whites. I know you mentioned your father had a run-in with the Klan here.
Right.
Was that your first contact with others of another race?
Well, actually, in our community, we lived on one street, and whites lived on the next street. And there was a family that lived right in back of us, whose name was Zito. They owned a grocery store. My grandmother worked for them, you know, took care of children when they went out and cleaned their homes and everything. But the children and I grew up together. We were really like best friends prior to going to school. And I was in their house a lot, they were in our house a lot. And at that particular time, of course, the issue of race was really not an issue for us at that young age. And I can remember, though, that our parents, my grandmother and mother, was more strict than their parents were. In fact, I remember being out their home one day, and his mother said something to him. He didn't like it, so he spouted back at her, and she hit him, and he hit her back, and nothing happened. We went on out to play. That's impressionable for a young man. I said, wow, he got away with that, so I better try this. I got home that afternoon, and my mother, not my grandmother, probably never would have done it with her. My mother said something to me, and I wrestled up at her. And she hit me, and I hit her back. Boy, she almost beat me to death. I said, I learned a lesson there. I said, well, I can't do the same thing that Frankie does with his mother, because that would be a little bit more consequence.
So even at that young age and with that little incident, you kind of learned that the races were different.
That's right.
Now, I kind of read in other interviews that the Birmingham Police Department was pretty prevalent in neighborhoods during that time. Did you or your family members have any contact with the Birmingham Police Department, and so what were they?
Well, I never remember the police coming to our house, but I remember an incident where the man across the street from us, his name was Mr. Robert. And Mr. Robert, every Friday, he was a contractor, and he built homes. And during the summer, I would actually work with him. But every Friday, Mr. Robert would get drunk. And we lived on a dirt street, gravel. And his house was directly across the street from ours. And we were on a dead end. So he had to bag out and then bag out in front of our house and then pull on, onto the street. And when he was drunk, we knew that we had to get out of the way, because when he pulled out, he was gonna put it in low gear and take off and throw gravel up on our porch, I remember once he got drunk and he went out to the neighborhood store. And the neighborhood store was owned by white people. And that day, when he went up there, an old policeman was there. And Mr. Roberts said something to the man and took off running. And the old man, he couldn't run as fast as Mr. Robert, although Mr. Robert was drunk. He came out, he had his gun out. And Mr. Robert's wife and everybody else in the community then sort of were watching, and she went out and begged this policeman, because Mr. Robert was sitting down at the end of the street, cursing the policeman out. And he was telling him everything that he'd ever wanted to tell a white person. And she went out and she pleaded with him not to shoot Mr. Robert. I said that he was drunk, and he didn't, and he allowed him to go in the house and go to bed or whatever, That was an encounter. There was another encounter, but not with the policeman. Really, there was a grocery store in our community. No, two grocery stores, one owned by a white family, the other owned by an Italian family. That's one of the different backgrounds. And then there was another one that was a service station, and it was owned by they were poor whites. But their son was a policeman, but they were known members of the Klan. And Mama would send me out to get a drink or get some washing powder or whatever. And also the mailman would always come there and sit, and that's where he collected the mail from. So one day I went out, I was gonna mail a letter, but I didn't have a stamp, so I gave Mr. Peters 3 cents and told him, would you mail this for me? asked me if he'd mail that for me. He said, well, what do you want me to do? Lick the stamp for you too? So I told him that's okay. So I walked out. And I didn't go back in that store for, I don't know how long, but it seemed like a long time. But he said to my grandmother, yeah, that boy of yours, he think he's something. He don't come back out here anymore. And Mama came and asked me, said, well, what happened? Because I didn't even tell her about it, But I told her, I said, well, I don't have to go out to this store, And I would not go out and be what I consider to be disrespected by him, although I couldn't say anything to him, but I didn't have to go out to the store. So Mama said, well, you're right. And she never did make me go anywhere, But the police in the neighborhood were treacherous. We had car number 51. And when you saw car number 51 coming, you knew that there was something going on. I remember that they picked up one of my friends. He was older than I was. We used to sort of hang out on the corner at this little delicatessen. And they picked up this buddy of mine. Well, it wasn't a buddy, he was older, but I knew him. He was from the neighborhood. And I don't really remember what had happened, but something had happened. And they put him in the back seat of their car. And in the back seat of the car was a German Shepherd. And, that was not a pretty sight. But policemen were not in our neighborhoods to protect and serve. They were simply there to control the community, and they did.
So you pretty much realized this at an early age and knew exactly how turbulent the racial situation was in Birmingham.
Yeah, there were all kinds of examples. Because I didn't have a father in the family, my grandmother wanted to make sure that I was manly, whatever that meant. So she would do, when I was 10, 11, 12 years old, she would actually send me downtown to pay the bills. We didn't have checking accounts at the time. I'd go downtown to pay, I remember walking to Alabama Power, to Alabama Gas, to furniture stores, Sokol's, and other places similar to that. But, you really don't think much about it at that particular time, but in retrospect, I thought about that. You go and get on a segregated bus, you sit in the back of that bus, you ride downtown, and it has the boards on it. So it's white on one side, colored on the other side. You ride downtown, you get off the bus, you go to Alabama Power, you have to go to the second floor. You can't ride the regular elevator, you have to either walk up or ride the freight elevator. She would always give me enough money to go to the show, get some popcorn, maybe buy a record or whatever. And I could always go to Newberry's. And I remember going to Newberry's and purchasing a hot dog and get that hot dog. But once you have purchased the hot dog, then you have to take it outside to eat it. You could not sit at the counter. And there was the Lyric Theater where blacks sat in the balcony, whites sat on the first floor. And we always say that was one of the mistakes that the segregation was made, because we would go to the Lyric Theater and get some water and just toss it down on them, And then we take off and go over to 4th Avenue to the famous, the Carper Theater. So we was wondering, well, why did they make that mistake? Why would they put us up there? Because we had all the fun, I remember getting back on the bus to go home and going past the fairgrounds, never being able to go out. And I always wanted to go out to the fairgrounds because of the glamour. It just seemed that it was so glamorous. I always wanted to go to the Alabama Theater because all of the lights, and it was, more glamorous than the Carver Theater, whatever. Because I actually had a couple of friends who the parents were white, and they went into the Alabama Theater, and they would come back and tell us how glamorous it was, but I never got a chance to go in at that particular junction. The first time that I got a chance to go to a state fair, well, here, black people were given a day at the state fair. And my grandmother was a proud black woman. She said if we couldn't go every day, we would not go on any days. So I never got a chance to go to the state fair until I was 23 years old in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I got a chance to go to the state fair. I rode everything. I think I must have eaten some of everything. And I was sick as a dog. But those are the kinds of things that you think about once you've gotten out of the situation that you're in. You don't really think about it while you're going through it.
Now, what elementary school did you attend?
Well, I started first grade at Riley Elementary School, which was, at that time, we lived probably 8 blocks from Riley Elementary. And at the school, and I remember it was a big white building. It's not the same Riley School, now they have a new building, but it was a big white wood structure. Well, a wood structure painted white. And at the entrance, it had a big sign that said Riley Negro School. And I remember that just as plain as if it was yesterday. And at the school, we had Mrs. Davis was the principal. And she was a pretty big woman, and she had a strap. Called that strap Black Magic. And you didn't want to get out of line because Black Magic would come to visit you. So I think she believed in corporal punishment.
Now, what about the racial mix-up of the teachers and the students? You said it was all black, so the teachers were all black as well?
Teachers all black, students all black, community all black, primarily, Now, as I told you, my best friends, really some of my best friends prior to going to school were white, so they were Italian. But when we started the school, they went to the Catholic school. And we went to our school, and we would play in the afternoons up until, I don't know, I guess probably until we got to junior high school. And of course, in high school, we never did associate. We'd see each other, but we would never really, in the summers, we would still play baseball together. But outside of just right there in the neighborhood, there were really no social relations between us.
Now, were you involved in any extracurricular activities at Raleigh Elementary School?
Yeah, at Raleigh, I was always active in, if there were, we always had to do speeches, different kinds of programs, assembly programs. I was always very active in those. I don't remember having clubs of any kind, like math club, until we got to high school. But I was pretty active. But whatever was going on, I usually was involved in it in elementary school.
And what high school did you attend?
Went to Winona High School. But prior to going to Winona High, I actually went to Winona Elementary School. Riley went from 1st to 8th grade. But in the 6th grade, I got into a fight at Riley and got kicked out of school. And I then decided not to go back to Riley. I went to Winona, to the elementary school. And it was rather interesting what the fight was about. My brother is mentally retarded. And another family that lived in Riley had a brother that was mentally retarded. They got into a fight. And I interceded, and then when I interceded, the other girls in this other family, there's not only girls in that family, and we got into a big to-do. Their family, both their grandmother and grandfather worked at the school, so they were, much better known than my folk were. So the fight then was blamed on me, and I got kicked out of school. They didn't get kicked out of school. And I was upset, so I said, well, I'm not going back to that school anymore. So I asked Mom if I could go to Winona, and I did.
Well, what were your experiences like at Winona Elementary School?
Well, Winona was a larger school, and I get to meet kids from other communities. Like at Riley, we basically I just knew people, you know, just to think about it. I really just knew people in Riley. But when I went to Winona, there were kids from Bristol High, from other adjoining neighborhoods. So I got to know a lot more students. Still, you know, I was a pretty good student. Not at the top of the class, but, you know, pretty close. But I remember we had, you know, we always talk about whether students learn better with other students of their capability, or do you mix it up? During our time, we had a guy in our class, his name was Bullman. That was his nickname. And Bullman, you know, you always have a child in the class that just can't learn. Bull was one of those people. So, but we wanted Bull to be good in school just as we were. So we decided, because he never participated. So one day we got together and we said, well, Bull, this is gonna be your question. We had a number of questions that we had to answer. Number 8 was gonna be Bullman's question. So we said, well, when Mr. Henry asked for number 8, nobody else raised their hand. Bullman's question. So when number 8 came around, Bull didn't raise his hand. Nobody else raised their hand. And all of us looked at Bullman, and finally, he said, oh, that's mine. He raised his hand, he answered the question, but he learned it, you know. I mean, he actually learned it, and we were all excited about Bullman participating, you know. And that was sort of highlight of the academic experiences, just to get somebody else involved in the process, you know. And then I went on to, but the elementary school was down the hill from the high school. And all of the bigger kids would walk through the elementary school ground, going to the high school. You would always want, man, I'd like to be able to go on up that hill at 8 o'clock in the morning. So it was, you know, we always had this idea of it being so much more glamorous to be in high school than it was in elementary school. And of course, eventually we would make it there.
So what were your experiences like at Winona High School?
It was a good experience. I enjoyed Winona High. We were still in the 9th grade. We were not in the special class. I don't think we had the special classes then. But anyway, this, of course, meant that there would be students from most of Southwest Birmingham, like from a larger geographic area than had been at Riley, or at Winona Elementary School. And I met people from Roosevelt, from Bessemer, from Raymond, from Powderly, you know, Shays Valley. And those kids that came from a distance were bused in. You know, we had about 15 bus loads that were brought in every day to the school. In the 10th grade, well, actually, I guess from about 7th or 8th grade, I always wanted to be an astronomer. And I was pretty good at math. And then I got 10th grade, I got the big head. And I was good, and I made good grades, but I don't think I learned very much after 10th grade. Although I still, you know, out of about 200, I was probably 20 something, maybe low 20s. But I did, and I was good at math. But after the 10th grade, I think what happened in the 9th and 10th grade, one of my instructors told us that anybody that still X number of A's would get an A in the course. And this was for algebra. I said, oh, that's no problem. So I went and sold my ass. So I didn't have to learn the algebra then. I thought I was getting over it. And of course, that would come back to haunt me because I never got any more math. I couldn't do algebra. And to this day, I still can't do algebra, But I passed, I got A's or B's in all of my classes from then on. And then when I went into college, I needed that algebra and couldn't do it. So, but I was on member of the Honor Society. Remember a couple other clubs, I don't remember what, and I was a big sports enthusiast. Played a lot of sports in the neighborhood. In my ninth grade, I was sort of touted as one of the better athletes in the community. And so when I got to high school, ninth grade, my reputation had sort of, beat me up there. So what I did, I got the big head, and I was playing one day, and the coach of the junior varsity saw me play, and he told my cousin, he said, I'd like you to play for me. So I told my cousin, so if he wants me to play for him, he'll come and ask me. He never did come and ask me to play. So I didn't go out for the team in the ninth grade. 10th grade, I went out, and I always say that he didn't let me make the team because of the ninth grade, 11th grade. And I probably wasn't as good as I thought I was. But in 12th grade, I finally made the team, but then I had my first attack of asthma, and the doctor wouldn't allow me to play. And I was really sick then. So I never did compete in athletics in high school.
Now, when you're in high school, that's the early 50s, mid 50s?
I graduated in 61. Mm-hmm. Started high school in 57.
Okay, so a lot of things had taken place in Birmingham by the time you arrived in high school. In 54, we have Brown versus Board of Education. In 56, NAACP is outlawed in Alabama, and the formation of the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights gets off the ground. Did you have any knowledge that these events were going on, and if so, were you involved in any of them?
I do not, of course, Brown versus Board decision, I don't remember that. Didn't know anything about it happening. In 56, when the movement was started, the NAACP was outlawed, I had no knowledge of that. I did know vaguely about the Alabama Christian movement and people going to jail, riding the bus, that kind of thing. But I was never involved in any of it. We lived really on the outskirts. In fact, at that time, we were in the county. We were about 7 miles from downtown. So much of the movement of those early days sort of bypassed us. We were not involved. There was no one in my family that was involved. However, later on, in the 60s, my wife, who would become my wife, her father and her grandmother would be very actively involved. So there were 2 or 3 of her siblings that were involved. But in those days that before 61, before we graduated, I didn't even know anybody that was involved in the movement.
Okay, and what would you do after high school?
I had planned to go to Tuskegee. We were in the accelerated class, so we got these whatever diplomas were, and there were 10 of us in my home class that were going to Tuskegee. And one day, our advisor, we were talking to her, she said, well, I know all of you are supposed to be going to Tuskegee, but one of you are not going to go. And we looked at her kind of strange because we knew all of us were going. And she evidently had already talked with my mother. My mother couldn't afford to send me to Tuskegee. I didn't know anything about the work programs. So all of them went on to Tuskegee, and I joined the military, joined the Air Force, to see the world, and they sent me to Grand Forks, North Dakota.
Pretty far away from home.
Yeah. I left here on August, I think it was August 11th, and spent 2 months in Texas, Lackland Air Force Base, basic training, and then I came back to Birmingham for leave. I guess I think it was about 30 days, and then I left Birmingham sometime in October, and it was about 75 degrees. So I wore my summer uniform, got to North Dakota. It was 20 degrees with a wind chill of about 10 below. I had never experienced anything like that in all my days. And that happened to have been one of the warmer days that I would experience while in North Dakota, because it was nothing for temperature to get down to 35, 40 below zero, with wind chill of 90, 95 below. So that was quite an experience from Birmingham, Alabama in mid-October to Grand Forks, North Dakota. It was more than I had bargained for.
Other than the weather adjustments, what other adjustments did you have to go through in the military? And this is, of course, after the armed forces is desegregated, but at the same time, there's still a lot of forces working within that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because in basic training, all of us, blacks and whites, were made to feel like nothing, like dirt, and then they build you up. But I remember when I was waiting during the summer, I had taken the test for the Army, and two of my other buddies took the test. Well, they were older than I. They took the test and they passed it, but the Army sat back and said, I didn't pass the test. And I was really upset. And so I went to test them for the Air Force. And it took like forever to get results back. And I was impatient. So I said, well, if I don't get my results tomorrow, I'm going to take the test for the Navy. So that day I got my results and I passed. I remember going to Montgomery for my physical. And I thought I was going to be able to come back home from Montgomery. They sent me directly to Grand Forks Air Force Base. And I was the only black on the train going to Lackland. And the train, though, was interstate, so it was not segregated. All of us were more or less together, but I remember all of these guys, all the white guys, and they were sort of huddled up in the compartment, and I was just part of it. And this one guy looked at me and said to me that I needed to go someplace else. And everybody else sort of did the same, so I left. I didn't do anything. So I was basically by myself all the way from Alabama to Texas. But when we got to Lackland Air Force Base, we were going to be a part of a flight. And evidently what they had done, they had all whites from Alabama with the exception of myself, but it was all blacks from Philadelphia. So I got with the brothers from Philadelphia and we took care of some business based upon what happened on the train, But while there, we became very close. And I remember one of my friends, he was not a best friend, but we were members of the same flight. He was from Savannah, Georgia, I believe, somewhere in Georgia. We left the base after the 2 months, and we sat together on the bus going to the airport, and then we sat together on the plane. And the plane took off from San Antonio, and we had a stop at Shreveport, Louisiana. And all this time, we've been spending a lot of time together. You know, everybody is the same, basically. You know, we get to Shreveport and go into the airport. And we both sat down at the table to order. And this waitress came over and she said to me, I can't serve you here. You have to go to the other side. And that hit me in the face like a bowl of grits, hot grits. And I didn't say anything. I just got up and left. I thought he would leave as well. He didn't leave, he sat there. We got back on the plane, it's the same plane. We got back on the plane, and rather than sitting in the seat next to me, he moved and sat in another seat. And that, you know, that said an awful lot to me about, of course, about him, but it also said a lot about the pressures that were on him to conform to what we thought we had left. And we never said anything else to each other.
Now, what would be your next destination after Louisiana?
We back to Birmingham, and there was just a stopover in Shreveport, then to Birmingham. And then after Birmingham, I would then go back. I mean, that's when I would get my assignment to Grand Forks, North Dakota. And that was rather interesting because, of course, in Grand Forks, there were no black folk except those that were on the base. And I remember going to a restaurant when I first got up there. And this lady was sitting across in a booth from me with two small children. And this little boy, he kept staring at me. And finally, she was trying to stop him from staring. Finally, he couldn't take it long. He said, Mom, look at that funny kind of man. And she apologized. She said, well, she was sorry, but he had never seen a black man before. And, you know, I was just taken aback, you know, I thought everybody had seen us someplace. But, and you can go downtown, Grand Forks. You wouldn't see anybody. In fact, when I got to Minneapolis, you go downtown, you wouldn't see any black folk. But there was some difficulty between blacks and town people. They didn't really particularly care for blacks to come downtown. They wanted to stay on base, and they made that known. But every year, the Red River would flood, and then they would call, the base would send volunteers down, so they would always ask for volunteers. So every year before I got there, they would go down and they would, you know, what do we call it, sandbag. So the year, my first year there, after finding that the people didn't want us downtown during the rest of the year, they asked for volunteers, and they were asking for volunteers, but they were actually telling us to, you know, to prepare to go down. And I refused to go. And I told the other guys that, you know, you guys, if you go, you're crazy. You know, everyone's down any other time. And so other guys then, in my squadron anyway, decided not to participate. Nothing happened. They didn't reprimand me or anything, but we decided that we were going to take that stance and didn't go. So I guess this may have been one of the first times that I had taken a stance on an issue where race seemed to have been paramount.
So although you're in another geographic region, it's kind of much like being in Birmingham.
Yeah, when it came to interaction, it was very much like Birmingham because that was little. Now, we could go to Canada, and it was a total different day and night. And that's where many of us would go on weekends to Winnipeg, Manitoba. And people there were seemingly totally different where race was concerned. I mean, it was white people. There were some blacks there too. But they looked at us very differently than people in the States. And I remember that I wanted to go to Canada so I could sit on the front of the bus. And I did. I went. That's the first thing I did when I got there. At my hotel, I went and sit on the front of the bus, sat in the seat. And I was just riding, I was enjoying myself. And a few blocks down, the bus stopped. And this white female, young girl, I guess probably about my age. And she got on the bus, and the bus was not crowded. She sat down right next to me. I almost, had spasms, see, as a white woman sitting next to me, don't you know I'm from Birmingham? You can't do that. And I was actually rather scared, and all I could think about was that I knew that Bull kind of had me on camera someplace and he was watching every move. And I sat just like this. And not only did she sit there, she started to talk to me. And after a while, I got comfortable, and I think we had a pretty good discussion. But I was terrified.
So that mentality was still pretty much ingrained in you.
Absolutely. You could take me out of Birmingham, but you couldn't take Birmingham out of me at that particular time. Not in that sense. And I remember that just, very, very vividly, that I wanted to go because I wanted to sit on the front of the bus, but I never imagined that this white woman would come and sit next to me. Now, I did know that white women were dating black men because that's why the brothers were going to Manitoba for the women, and they were basically white women. And I knew that, and I guess that probably had something to do with my wanting to go, but the first thing I wanted to do was sit in front of the bus.
Now, did you keep in touch with any of your relatives back home as to what exactly was going on here? I know in the 60s, a lot of things were happening in Birmingham. 63 was a really turbulent year for Birmingham. The bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, a lot of the demonstrations with the kids that were going on, trying to desegregate the stores downtown. Did you have any awareness of that going on? Yes, I
kept in touch with someone at least once a week, probably even more than that. In fact, press the button again. Press the.
We're saying that you were keeping in constant contact with the people here.
Yeah, I actually kept a running tab. I would get the Minneapolis Tribune every day, and I made a scrapbook with every article that the Minneapolis Tribune had on that particular year between April and May of 1963. Kept all those articles. I was in constant contact. And in fact, I would request leave in May of '63. And the officer that I worked for told me that he wasn't going to give me a leave because I didn't need to go to Alabama at that time. And I told him that, well, whether you give me a leave or not, I have to go to Birmingham. And he understood that I was going to come anyway. So he did give me a leave, so I did get to come home probably right after the children's demonstrations. And I was probably home, probably about a month at that time. Normally when I would come home, I would take 30 days. So I spent time in Birmingham, but my girlfriend was at Tuskegee, so I spent as much time at Tuskegee as I was at Birmingham.
Now, do you remember the day that 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed?
I don't remember the day, but I remember that we Well, I don't know if it was that day or whether it was sometime that week, but I can remember sitting in our day room. That's where TV was in the barracks and all. And I don't think we had any disturbances, but there was some discussion about Birmingham, because what most people would ask is that, you know, what was it like to live in Birmingham? Everybody thought that, you know, they just couldn't believe that, you know, that I was from Birmingham, Alabama. But I cannot recall that specific day that it happened, but I know that there were discussions about it. And it may have been that day, or maybe, you know, a few days after. But I had a clipping of that as well. When I first got to North Dakota, there were very few blacks from the South. I mean, just to ask people, you know, where were they from? Everybody was from Cleveland or Chicago or Philadelphia. But I noticed that there were guys that had black Southern accents. So there's one brother, I said, man, I know you my homeboy. He said, man, I'm from PA. I said, PA? So I was kind of puzzled. A few days later, I saw him again. I said, where did you say you from? He said, I'm from PA, man. I said, man, you know you from Mississippi. He said, no, I'm from PA. And finally, I guess it was a few days later, I said, come on, homeboy, tell me, where you from? He said, I'm from PA. I said, well, what does PA mean? He said, Pineapple, Alabama. So he was from Pineapple. But there were guys who were from Mississippi, from Alabama, from Georgia. They would always say they were from someplace else. And it was not until myself and a buddy from Jackson, another buddy from Mississippi, and one from Virginia, we'd always say that we were from where we were. But there was one guy who swore he was from Cleveland, Ohio. And, you know, we just accepted it. But one day they made us put our serial numbers on our doors. And our serial number started 1476. And this guy, we got home that evening from work. And we looked at all the doors, and on his door, we knew that he was not from Cleveland, but we didn't know where he was from. He had the same serial, same first four that we had. Mm-hmm. And 1476 was Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, I believe. Turned out he was from Meridian, Mississippi. And he was so upset that we found out that he actually cried. And he did not want to be from the South. And, you know, for obvious reasons, nobody wanted to be associated with the brutality and the supposed the subordination that black folk had to encounter in the South. So people simply didn't want to be from the South.
Now we're not.
Okay, Dr. Huntley, what did you do after you left the Air Force?
When I left the Air Force, I went to Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I was enrolled in an electronics school, Control That Institute. In fact, I was in the very first class that Control That I had for computer. Well, it wasn't computer programming, although we had programming. It was computer technology, I guess. And I finished school there, but while there, we were, Barbara and I, my wife, we were married in '64. She was a senior at Tuskegee, and I was, you know, going on my last year in the Air Force. But she went back to Tuskegee, and I went back to North Dakota, so we were way apart for that 1 year. And then when I got out of service, I went to Minneapolis, and she finished school, so she came to Minneapolis. So we met there, and that's where we really first set our household up. Young, but we were 22, both of us were 22. And that summer, we both volunteered at a community center. And because she was going to be teaching in the fall, so she started teaching in the fall, and then I started school in the fall at the electronic school, but we stayed at the community center in the evenings. After finishing that electronic school, I then went to work for Honeywell. No, I worked for Honeywell part-time, I believe, while part of the time that I was in school. And then I went to work at Control Data when I finished that. But we still worked at the volunteer community center in the evenings. And this was with young children that were associated with the community, but the community center was associated with the church, so Baptist Community Center. And the kids were, from elementary through high school age. And it was rather interesting. We were relatively young ourselves, and Barbara she looked like she was probably in 9th grade or something. She looked real young. But we had a good rapport with the kids at the time. And so I went on, worked for a year at Control Data. And after that year, I decided, with some encouragement from Barbara, to go back to the University of Minnesota. And that's when I started at the university. So I was a 25-year-old freshman at the University of Minnesota.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about your time at the university. I know a lot of important things happened while you were there. First of all, what was the racial makeup of the University of Minnesota when you entered?
When I entered in 1967, there were about 47,000 students at the University of Minnesota. Out of 47,000 students, there were 87 Black students. And the vast majority of those were from Minneapolis and St. Paul. And it was rather curious because in the South, when we saw people, we always spoke. People in Minnesota, Blacks in Minnesota, you'd see them on campus, they wouldn't even speak to you. There were, I guess 3 or 4 of us from the South. And I remember when I first met Sister Rose Freeman, we became real good friends. She spoke and I spoke, I think probably simultaneously. And it was a great feeling because, we had been ignored. Nobody would speak before. And we started talking. It was just like we had been, close friends for a long time. And then we started, they'd actually started a year before I got to develop an organization called the Afro-American Action Committee. And I got involved with the group. And Rose was president at the time. And I got involved, and being a little bit older than most of the other students, I knew what I had to do to get out of there. But there allowed us to spend a lot of time in the red room. And I would sort of tell the young students, you need to get out of here, you need to go to class and, see that people at class and stuff. So we spent a lot of time together and then trying to develop somewhat of a cohesiveness with the Black students on campus. And a lot of them were athletes, and the athletes were not involved at all. And I got involved with the athletes through a fraternity, and I joined Omega Psi Phi fraternity. And most of the athletes would become Qs as well. And as a result of that bond, we then got them involved in the African American Action Committee. And that would lead to some real unified efforts on campus in relationship to a number of issues that we were involved in.
Okay, could you just tell me a little bit about what the committee did? What was the...
Yeah, the committee was basically interested in getting more Black students enrolled at the university. We we had developed sort of a campaign to get that done. And it was rather difficult because the administration really didn't see the need in allocating funds for that. And what we wanted to do was to set up in '68, as a result of Dr. King's assassination, set up a Martin Luther King Scholarship Fund. And they didn't see the need to do it at the time. We also was developing a national Black student conference, where we would attract people from all over the country to come to the University of Minnesota. We said, well, if people come here and find out what's here, then some will probably enroll. The university wasn't interested in that as well. I had an experience in one of my classes where, in American history class, this professor's name was Professor Burkhofer. And Professor Burkhofer, he didn't like students, period. Not just Black students, he just didn't like students. He was very arrogant, and no one ever spoke in his class. You know, he lectured for 45 minutes and he left. If you wanted to talk about any issues, you talk with his teaching assistants. So one day he talked about slavery for about 5 minutes. And that's the only time that he ever mentioned Black folk in the class. So when I raised my hand, he didn't acknowledge my hand. So I stood up. He still didn't acknowledge me. And finally, I just interrupted him. I said, excuse me, Professor Burkhofer. And he looked at me. And everybody else was looking at me too, because I'm the only Black, and there were 2 of us in the class, 2 Blacks in the class, out of probably 400. And I asked him, I said, well, you just covered, the only time that you talk about Black people in this class is when you talk about slavery. Are you gonna cover anything else where Blacks are concerned? In Black history, he said, oh, is there more? Very arrogantly. And I said, sure there is. And I started talking. And he said, well, I'll give you equal time. I said, well, does that mean that I have the rest of the term to clear up many of the things that you've been saying? That's incorrect. And he didn't like that. He said, no, I'll give you a class period. So he gave me a class period. And I had, prior to coming to the university, I had met a guy by the name of Mahmoud El-Khati. Mahmoud was a historian, and he became my mentor. So when he told me he was going to give me a class period, I was kind of frightened, you know. I mean, I've got to talk before 400 people. I've never done that before. So I went and talked to Mark. Mark then gave me some advice on how to do it and, you know, where to get my materials from. So I got John O. Franklin from Slavery to Freedom and just laid out something. I don't even remember what I talked about, but I remember feeling very good about it. And after it was over, well, prior to him, to my doing the talk, he tried to frighten me. He said, well, you know, I'm gonna have all my TAs here, and I will probably invite some of my colleagues over to listen to your lecture. I said, well, that's fine. You know, I couldn't back up at that time, you know, I had pride on the men. So I said, well, do you think you can get Williams Arena, and can we get WCCO TV here to, you know, to tape it? And, you know, I'm just going on. You know, we went on. Anyway, I gave a lecture, and afterwards, you know, I felt good about it. I thought I'd done a good job, and I went over and asked him, you did a good job. And everybody was coming up asking me, you know, praising me and everything. So and I knew that now I'm getting arrogant. So I said, well, so I did such a good job, I'd like for that to be in lieu of my final exam. He said, oh, sure. And he did. He gave me a C out of the course. And I was real upset. But we then started clamoring for development of an African American Studies department. And this time then there were 3 issues on the table. There was the African American Studies department, the development of the Martin Luther King Scholarship Fund, and asking the administration to assist us financially in carrying out the Black Student Conference. And on all three counts. They said no. So the African American Action Committee then went into session and we talked about what we were gonna do to get them to change their mind. So we decided then to go to the president. And a delegation of us, I think 3 or 4 of us, went up to his office unannounced and to see him. When we got there, they told us that he was out of town and that he would be back tomorrow, the next day, around 1 o'clock. And we said we would like to, have an appointment with him. So, we set up the appointment. We went back then to the rec center with the student union. And the next morning, we had another meeting of the organization. And this time, there were probably 40, 50 people there because we'd gotten the word out that we were going to go and talk to Malcolm Lewis, who was the president of the school, and that we were going to demand these 3 items. So people were excited, because this is the first time this has happened at the University of Minnesota. So when we got to the place, we said, what happens if they say no? We couldn't decide on what we were going to do. And we kept talking. About 1:45, we said, we have to go. So we decided to leave. We went on to Morrill Hall, the administration building. And there were probably 30 or 40 of us that went. And we went into the board room. And that's where we were going to meet. The president eventually came out and he sat and talked with us. And we told him what we were demanding. And he said, I really understand what you're saying, but, I don't have the authority. We can't do those things. And so we said, we pay our fees and blah, blah, this, that, and other, whatever. And that we thought it was necessary that we have an African American Studies department, that it was only right to try to get more Black students here through the Martin Luther King Scholarship Fund, and we could assist you in doing that. And we also thought it necessary that the university would have some Black programming on campus, and this Black student conference would bring some Black programming. And they said, no, they couldn't do any of it. So there were myself and Sister Rose. We said, we got up, we walked downstairs. And while we were walking down, we were just talking about, what are we going to do? So rather than leaving the building, we then decided to go into the bursar's office. And everybody followed us into the bursar's office. Now you can imagine this is the University of Minnesota. You never seen this many Black folk together. You got 40 Black folk walking into the bursar's office. And, people were just amazed and startled. And once we got in there, we decided that we were not going to leave until some of those demands were met. So we remained in the administration building. We would allow people to leave, but we wouldn't allow anybody to enter. And we basically cordoned off the doors, and we did a sit-in. And we were there for overnight. And overnight, we then started negotiating with the administration. And the administration, sometime around 12, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, they agreed on all 3 points. And the next morning, it was day when we left, there were white students outside that were really upset because they were saying that, you can't shut down our university. You can't. And our refrain to them was that we've been shut out of society for 300 years, and they can't be shut out one day without saying that they're going to charge the building and do some damage, bodily harm to us. That never came to fore. That morning, they had surrounded white students that surrounded the administration building, and The buildings at Minnesota though were connected by tunnels. So rather than our going out through the crowd, we went down through the tunnel to the other side of the mall, all the way down to the end of the mall, back across to another building, and then out in the to the outside. And when we got down there, we looked back and there was a huge crowd of white students, and we just turned around and we waved at them and kept on across the bridge. You know, they never did come anything. But that's, I think if we had come out, you know, directly out of that building, there probably would have been some disturbances. So the administration suggested that we take that route, and we did. And we got that done. We got the department, African American Studies Department. We were on the committee that developed it. We basically, we didn't have a veto of anything, but we were very forceful in how we wanted the department to look. And because they were saying that there were not people qualified to teach. So we brought Mark Mood over, and we recruited several other people from, you know, from out of town. We were arrested. There were 3 of us that were arrested as a result of the takeover. The administration had said that they were going to deal with us, but the city government, the mayor's name was Stenvig. Mayor Stenvig decided, well, I don't get some Stenvig, but anyway, the grand jury indicted us. And that then made for a unified force on campus, because campus, at that time, you know, the Vietnam War was going on, so white students were actively involved in that. So they supported us, and we had a demonstration on probably the day that we were arrested. There was a demonstration of about 10,000 students that marched from the university to downtown courthouse. And we had a huge, a massive demonstration inside and outside the courthouse. Because the white students, the Student Government Association, the Students for Democratic Society, a number of other organizations were very supportive, and they sort of galvanized the activists on campus anyway. So we were tried, 3 of us were tried, and we were found not guilty on destruction of property, whatever. And I think we got a misdemeanor. But it was an experience that really galvanized that campus for Black and white students against the administration and in favor of change. And as a result of that, we got Martin Luther King scholarship program that created slots for Black students. We developed the African American Studies Department, and they actually paid for the student conference that we had. And during that conference, we had Jim Turner, who is now a professor at Cornell University. At that time, he was a graduate student at Northwestern University. I think he's in political science, urban studies. And he was one of the speakers that we invited up. We had Muhammad Ali. We had a dance troupe from Harlem. We had had a brother from Washington, D.C., who started an organization called Pride. And we had students from all over the country, as well as California, that came to that student conference. So we were very proud of being able to pull that together and to organize to the extent that we could show the administration the necessity for developing those kinds of programs. And as a result of that, the department actually recruited people from all over the country, and it became one of the premier programs. And as a result of that, myself and Sister Rose became two of the first graduates with a degree in African American Studies in the country.
So you were very much a part of the Black Power movements that were going on in the 60s, not directly, but you were doing some of the same things that were going on other campuses.
Right, and we had relationships with other campuses, and the Black Power movement. In fact, I remember meeting Stokely Carmichael for the first time on campus. Right after in '66 on the March to Mississippi, where he talked about what Black people need is Black Power. And I guess it probably was '68 when he came to campus and gave a speech. But Sister Rose knew him personally because she was in SNCC in Mississippi. She was from Greenwood, Mississippi. So they knew each other personally. So we got Stokely up there to speak. We had Muhammad Ali came up. There were a number of very notable individuals that we got to come to speak at that particular point. But yeah, it was right in the Black Panther Party, of course, was very active, and there was an active Panther Party in Minneapolis. We knew all those guys, and they were very closely associated with us. So when we went to administration building, they were there to help us, supposedly there to protect us. So that was a real close-knit Black community in Minneapolis at the time. And since I was working in the community, I didn't live on campus. I lived in South Minneapolis. Sister Rose worked at a community center in North Minneapolis. So, and that is where Black folk lived, in North and South Minneapolis. So when we then went into the administration building, people from the community came to our rescue. So it was really rather uniquely developed in that we were not isolated from the community. We were actually part of the community.
Okay, I want to just back up a little. One of the demands that the group made was for a scholarship fund in Martin Luther King's name. I just wanted to ask you, do you remember where you were and what you were doing when Dr. King was assassinated?
Yeah, we were at the community center, and I remember that the kids were really excited. They wanted to get out on the street, and some did. It was not like Chicago any place, but there were some throwing the cars and that kind of thing. But I remember initially we took all the kids downstairs in the church, and we sat and talked about what it meant. But then once we left, then sort of not all havoc broke out, but it was some disturbances, and there were actually a couple of whites that came through the community at that time, driving suspiciously, and I don't know whether they were attempting to cause some problems or what, but I remember our following one of the cars, and they had 2 or 3 white boys in the car, white men or whatever, to see that they were just going to go on through community rather than stopping and creating some problems. But it was a rather difficult time. As a result of that, when at Dr. King's funeral, we were able to take, I don't know how many kids we took, but we took a lot of kids to Atlanta for the funeral. General Mills, 3M, several other big companies donated their planes, and we were able to take some kids to Atlanta to the funeral.
So you did attend Dr. King's funeral?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, now you graduated from the University of Minnesota. You have one of the first degrees in African American Studies. Where do you go from there?
Well, we had volunteered, Barbara and my wife had volunteered. We were gonna go to, volunteer for Peace Corps. We were going to Ghana. We were due to leave for 2 weeks to come to Atlanta for orientation. But prior to that, we had to take physical exams. When we took the physical exam, we found out that Barbara was expecting with our first child. So that changed our whole life. We didn't make the trip to Ghana. I then had a fellowship offer to go to Syracuse University. And we took that, we went to Syracuse, where I did my master's. I was in school for a year, and then the program had another year that we would actually teach. So I was in school the first year, and then the second year, taught at the University, it's the State University of New York at Oswego. That's upstate New York, about 40 miles, I guess, northwest of Syracuse.
Okay, after that, where did you go on to your doctorate?
No, from there, I took a job at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, and I was there for a year. And from there, I then received another fellowship to do the doctorate at the University of Pittsburgh. And at the University of Pittsburgh, I met David Montgomery, who was the chairman of the department at that time, the history department there. And he was a labor historian. Now he's the #1 labor historian in the world. And David and I became very close friends. So I then started to do African American labor history. And my topic was the International Union of Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers, as it was organized here in Birmingham in the 1930s. It was an interracial experiment, I would say, interracial labor.
Okay, and then you say you went to the University of Pittsburgh for your doctorate?
Right.
Okay, and once you were in Pittsburgh, where did you do your doctoral dissertation on horses? Was it?
Right, it's
Okay.
Mine Mill, the International Union of Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers. And I
Okay.
did that because there really was very little that was written about mine mill, particularly in Birmingham. I found about several pages in a book that talked about mine mill in Birmingham. But my grandfather had been a member of the Mine Mill and Smelter Workers Union. And I remember very vaguely when I was growing up, something about labor, and I remember going to the barbershop and old men were coming in, they were probably 30 at the time. They would come in, they would talk about what's happening in the mine. I of course, didn't pay attention then. But as I started to study this, I then remembered some of those men. I knew many of those men that were involved in it. So that became my first effort into really digging into the history of Black labor. And I did that as an oral history project. So my dissertation was based primarily on oral histories.
Okay, so this is one of your first experiments into oral history at a time when probably wasn't very popular to do.
That's right. It was not very popular to do oral history at the time, and labor history and Black history both were not looked upon very favorably, even in the academic community. But David Montgomery, who was a top labor historian, and we just became real good friends. And he really became my mentor in terms of labor because he knew his labor history. And he sort of he did direct my dissertation.
Okay. Now you have your PhD. What do you do from there?
In June, I had come home the year before I finished up. a year and a half before I finished up, and I went over to the university, UAB, to the history department to see if I can find sources. Couldn't find any sources, but I was approached by the chair of the department at that time. She asked me if I ever considered coming back home after I finished up. And of course I had, but I, played hard to get. I said, well, no, not really. So she said, well, why don't you call us when you get close to finish? We would like to talk with you. So I decided, I did. And they sent for me when we come down for an interview. And I was talking to Barbara, but she was just the opposite. She said, I always said I was always coming back to Birmingham once I finished up. She always said she would never live in Alabama again. So as we discussed coming back, she said that she didn't want to come back to Birmingham. She wasn't coming back. And so I called UAB and told them that we decided we were not going to come. They asked why, and I told them, why don't we just send for your whole family, send for your wife and your children and everybody. So he did, and they wined and dined us for 3 days. And I promised Barbara that we'd just be here for a couple of years. If we didn't like him, we'd leave him. And when we got here, we were at a party or something. Someone asked me, oh, you back home? How long are you going to be here? So we're here to stay. And she never let me live that down. So, but we've been here now for a long time, 20-something, 30, 76. It's at 22 years.
Okay, well, I know you've been involved in a lot of different things since returning to Birmingham. So let's just start with the things that you've done at UAB. First of all, I'd like to know about the courses that you taught when you came back to teach at UAB.
I initially started teaching African American history, American history, and urban studies. What I was trying to do, I was developing a sequence in African American history, 3-course sequence that went very well. Taught an American history course one term, and then the next term I teach a graduate level urban studies. Eventually I then would start teaching the urban studies because I had a joint appointment between history and urban studies. So I'd teach a full load was 2 courses per term. And I had not finished the doctorate when I arrived here. I still had to finish the dissertation. My first term here, I would complete the dissertation and I would go back to defend it in December, and that's when I would be awarded the degree the following term. So with the appointment being both history and urban studies, I taught in both departments. By the same token, I had taught within Project Coming about establishing an African American Studies program. And in '78, I started writing a proposal for that program, and it was finally, I guess in '79 or so, it was instituted, where it was an interdisciplinary program. And I established a 3-course sequence in African American history, and I would other people from various disciplines would offer courses periodically. And for a while it worked okay, but what happened is that after time, my courses were only courses that were being offered on a regular basis. So students then would have difficulty in completing the 18 hours. So then I had to start giving independent studies to have people be able to complete the minor. And we did that, and I'm not sure how many students actually minored. There were quite a number. But I knew that simply couldn't last. And so we started talking about the necessity for a department of African Studies, or African American Studies. And this is probably after 10 years or 12 years or so. The administration would never commit the resources to do that. So then, and they always said that, they just didn't have money because that's a commitment to make. So myself, and a couple other black faculty members went to a state senator and asked him if he would allocate monies to develop a department. And we talked, and he researched and came back and said he would put in $500,000 a year for a Black Studies department. The administration was livid. They said that they didn't want him to do that because that would take away from other programs, and they would not go along with it. And the senator was Fred Horn, and he said that he would see to it that the money would in fact be there. They fought it, and they eventually, what it really came down to was Fred would lose the election, and that would be the end of that money. We couldn't get the other legislators to be as forceful as Fred had been. So Fred was the chair of the finance committee in the state, and he held the purse strings, and he could have done it. But the administration was totally opposed to it. But what they decided to do was what they call enhance the program. So they hired someone else, brought that person in, and now they're supposedly have a program with a list of courses, about the same number that I had. And they're having the same problem that I was having, is that the courses are not offered on a regular basis because, see, our argument was that if you have a department, then you have people, you bring people in specifically to teach African American studies. But what has happened, they in fact look upon African American studies in the same way that whites have looked upon blacks. And that's been negative because I doubt very seriously if a person who simply had an interest in history, a history buff, would be allowed to come to the history department and teach a history course. That would not be allowed, or any other department. But for African American studies, the only thing a person has to have is an interest in the disciplines, not necessarily any training. See, I'm the only one on campus that had a degree in African American studies. But what they would do is send out a letter and ask people, would you like to teach a course in African American studies? And that is what the administration allowed. So I then sort of disassociated myself from that process because it obviously was not meeting the standards that were being set by agencies that were looking at African American studies. And of course, it didn't meet my standards.
All right, now you are now challenging the status quo and the UAB administration. Did you feel any personal repercussions as a result of your action, or were there any problems between yourself and the administration, other faculty, because of that?
Yeah, well, there was, there's been a court case, I'm trying to think of the name, of higher education court case in the state of Alabama, that was looking at the inequities in development of education in black institutions and white institutions. And I actually testified against white institutions because, for obvious reasons, the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa made a statement that they never had a policy of segregation. How ridiculous can you be? Yeah. And it's very obvious that the funding has been, inequitable. So I was brought into the case and made statements that is public information right now about higher education in the state of Alabama and what had happened, and also about Black studies the judge, or what happened initially, Judge U.W. Clemens was the sitting judge on the case. They removed him from the case because they said he had been a civil rights lawyer and he was black. But who they put on the case instead was a old white man from Rome, Georgia, Judge Murphy. He was probably, it's late 60s, he was probably 70 years old. And, I mean, what kind of rationale can you use? You take a person off that's pro-civil rights, African American, and you put another person on, not to say that he was not to suggest that Judge Murphy was anti-black or anything, but how can you suggest that Judge Clemens was going to be biased and that Judge Murphy would not be biased from another perspective? So I then testified. As a result of making that testimony, there were actually people in my department who stopped speaking to me. There was, a number of other things that would take place. But what I got the impression that the department was attempting to isolate me. And I always told them that you cannot isolate me because I'm at home. My life is not totally focused on what you're doing here. I have a life outside of the university. And of course, they attempted to change my title to adjunct professor. There are a number of other things, and we had letter writing campaigns. I had to write the dean. I had an encounter with one of the vice presidents. The vice president once came to one of the Black History programs, and the program was entitled something like, "What was it like being a black on a white college campus?" And he invited himself to participate. And he came over with all kinds of statistics of how much progress UAB was making, and we have increased by X number. And I just asked him, I said, "Well, Jim, you've given those statistics. I'd like to know, put some names." I said, "I've been here for 15 years. Tell me, who are these people that you're talking about that you've added to the faculty? Because I don't know of any." Afterwards, he came to me and he said, "Well, that was intellectually dishonest." And I said, "Well, you're right. Because everything that you presented was intellectually dishonest." And he got upset, and I got upset. And we almost went to blows. We didn't. But that was part of the encounter. So I was having, I basically would tell whoever raised some issues, if they were not telling the truth, I would raise questions about it. And that's not something you do as a black man in this country. You accept it and you go with your tail tucked. And I refused to do that. So then that resulted in, a number of things happening on campus.
Okay. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the things that you've done in the city, but before that, I just remembered something. I know you requested your FBI file through the Freedom of Information Act. And I wondered if you could tell us if you found, I know you've done a lot, so I wondered if there are any interesting things in there that you might want to share with us about.
Well, actually, they did a very good job in following me everywhere. And, I remember once where I was at home early morning, like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And this voice from someplace, I was dreaming, I guess, said, "Get up and look out your window." And I did. I got up, looked out my window, and there was a guy underneath my car. And it was in the winter. I mean, it was snow on the ground and everything. He was underneath my car, so I was wondering. And I recognized him. And it was one of the guys that was in our organization. So the next morning, I went out, I didn't go out that night. I thought it was, it was gonna blow up or something, So I went out and there was a little device, and it happened to be a home device, I guess just to let them know where I am or whatever. But he was obviously working on the cover within the organization. And when we were in the administration building, we found out during the trial that he was on the phone the whole time, giving whatever we did, he was telling someone, I don't know who he was talking with. But all that was in the file. It didn't name the person, but I happened to put two and two together and could determine who it was. But, it was amazing because although I was active, there were a lot of people that were a lot more active than I. But I had nearly 300 pages in my FBI file. So they would, one of the things that they consistently did was they just tried to follow wherever you went, whatever you did. And when I left Minneapolis and went to Syracuse, they followed me there. And I wrote a letter to the insurance company because the insurance company had dropped my insurance. And I don't know whether I got a ticket or whatever, but I wrote them a real heated letter about how the Black community would not look very favorably upon this. And they sent a guy from Minneapolis to Syracuse to talk with me about that. And that's in my files, and you name it, if I did it, it's in the files.
It's amazing.
It's amazing.
Okay, well, now let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the things that went on, not at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, but within the city itself. I want to start with the Board of Education of the city. I know that because the city is predominantly Black, the school system certainly is predominantly Black, that you favor an Afrocentric education and that you push for that. I want to know sort of the specifics of exactly what your position is and what you've done to try to get that.
Yeah, okay. This Birmingham proper is about 65% Black. The school system is 93% Black. But we've been on the court order for a long time now to have the faculty is 50-50. So faculty usually about 50-50, but the student population is 93% Black. Which meant, really there's a reason for that because you have to look at how the neighborhoods are situated. In the 60s when Blacks started to move, actually when UAB bought all of that property on the south side, that was a neighborhood, that was a community. 6th Avenue Baptist Church was right where it's on 6th Avenue and it was 16th Street South. On the same corner, on the north side, 6th Avenue and 16th Street North, was 16th Street Baptist Church. Well, they were sister churches, but UAB came in and they purchased all that land and 16th Street and the whole community was displaced. So then African American people started moving into West End and other neighborhoods that happened to have been white. And as soon as they moved in, whites moved out. So of course, that created then a situation just as in many other urban areas, when Black folks moved into the area, white folks started moving out to the suburbs. I remember when I moved back to Birmingham in '76, I moved into the West End area. And right next to me was an older white man. He was a mine foreman. A week or so after I moved in, he put a sign, his for sale sign out. And we were out one day and I talked to him. I asked, so why are you moving? He said, the community's just deteriorating. Here I am, PhD, my wife is in line to be principal. But the neighborhood is deteriorating because a Black family moved in next door to you. So that then will result in the city becoming a predominantly Black city. the school system becoming, overwhelmingly black. Still in Birmingham as in other places, you still had to fight to get courses on black history, black culture, or whatever in the school systems. You still talk to kids today, and they still don't have a lot of it. Although black people are in control of the system now. So there are some of us that say, well, if we are in control, the school system is a black school system, why not look at an African-centered curriculum, just as been done in other places? We had clamoring mostly from black folks that were in authority who were really apologetic to whites because we were raising this kind of issue. Another issue that we raised was that white people have moved out of the city, black people in control, but we are still retaining 40% of the school board for whites. I said, that's ridiculous, Why should white people have 40% of the school board when they're only 7% of the student population? Those parents, those people who are in the city, lives here, they need to have that control of the city. And even some black people disagree with that because they want to be multicultural. And I don't have any difficulty with that, but I'm looking at the reality of it. The reality of it is a black system, and that we need to be able to control our own destinies. And it appeared that we were doing the very same thing that we had done even under the segregationist era. Like when Dr. King first came to Birmingham, there were black folk that said that he was outside agitated, he shouldn't come in because all it's going to do is hurt the progress that we had made in race relations when we hadn't made it. And these were people that were in prominent positions in Birmingham, blacks that in prominent positions. And I see the same thing happen. So I was actually appointed, and I don't know why they appointed me, to this advisory committee to the board that were advising them on the development of a strategic plan. And one of my issues was that of an African-centered education. There were student representation on the board, on the committee, who happened to agree with me, and there were others on the committee that agreed. But they would only agree in private. In fact, we had a little meeting at my house, and there were probably 6 or 7 of us there, and all of us agreed that this is our strategy, and we would see that this happened. When we got back to the big meeting where there were 30-some people, there were 2 of us that would speak. The others just sat there, wouldn't say anything. So the point is, what we were attempting to do is to make the system reflect the history and culture of the people that it was serving. And that became very difficult to do. We still have not achieved that. We're still working on it.
I know you also got involved with the city government of Birmingham. Now, you ran for city councilman, but before we get into that, I'd like to know a little bit about some of the things that you did, some of the efforts that you made in relation to the government of Birmingham before that time.
Well, I've been involved with the community for some time, active in my own neighborhood, with just everyday amenities, talking about those kinds of things. I've been actively involved. I've been on the Birmingham Historical Society, trustee for the society, I think. I was also a member of the Birmingham Historical Commission, and what we did, we looked at historical sites, and we tried to get places renovated rather than torn down. One of the things that really, I think one of the most devastating things that has happened with historical sites is that the terminal station, which was a very historic site, was demolished. And we only have pictures of that now. So a commission was developed to see that that would not happen any longer. Recent years, I've been involved with the Million Man March and the chair of the local organizing committee of the Million Man March. And of course, that was a lot of controversy in that because Mr. Louis Farrakhan called the Million Man March in '96. And just as we reacted to Malcolm X in the '60s, people are still reacting to Mr. Farrakhan the same way. And they tried to paint him one way, tried to paint him as anti-Semitic and anti-white, without really listening to what he's saying. Yeah. And I think that we have to really start making determinations for ourselves rather than allowing people outside of our community to make decisions for us. We have to make decisions about who we are supported by. I remember in the '60s when Malcolm was talking, there would be people who were prominent who would agree with him in private, but in public, they were afraid. And we have the same kind of situation today. As a member of the local organizing committee, we developed a prison support group. We developed sort of a format by which Black kids could be adopted because we found that Black kids are usually the last ones to be adopted. Many didn't have homes. We have that the local organizing committee is also one of the initiatives has been development of an African-centered education in the public school system. So there have been a number of issues that we have attempted to focus on, and we're still doing those things. Excuse me.
Okay. When you eventually ran to try to become a member of the city council, how exactly did you get involved in that? How did that happen? And just some of your reactions to the whole process.
Okay. Yeah. People have approached me a year and a half before the election and asked me if I would run for city council. And I told them I really didn't have an interest in running for city council. So they said, well, don't make a decision now, but sometime before the election, a year or so before the election, you should let us know if you will or not. And it came down the year before, and I told them that I still hadn't changed my mind, but I would give them a definite answer by the first of the year, which would give 8 months, 10 months before the election. So the first of the year, I still didn't want to run, so I told them that, I really, appreciate them asking, but I was really not interested in a political career. So they wouldn't take that no for an answer. So in June, they asked me again, I said no, and I went away on vacation in July, and I came back and I had been drafted to run. And I sat down with people who had drafted me. It was a coalition of organizations. And I really couldn't dispute what they were saying. So I then said, well, okay, if you can gather the troops, I'll submit. So that really was the way it happened. But then it was really late. It was 5 weeks before the election. We gathered the troops and had really good people working with me because, see, I'm a novice in the political arena, didn't know anything about it. But William Muhammad and Don Blankenship sort of led the campaign, and they had experience. We just got to working, and what happened is they knew basically how a campaign should be run. and they started the process. And I was very comfortable in going out talking to people, so we walked the neighborhoods every evening. Sometimes I walked by myself just talking to people. And I had approached some people and they said, well, Horace, it's too late. If you'd come early, I would have, supported you, but, I've committed to somebody else. And I understood that, because I did wait late. Finally, what happened, of course, is that the day of the election, the front runner, she won, but she didn't win by 51%, 50 plus 1. I think she had maybe 41%. And I came in second, so that a runoff between the two of us. So she, and we had another 3 weeks to run. And in those 3 weeks, I gained momentum, and she added another 300 votes to her, to her number, and I added about close to 1,100 votes to mine, but I still fell short. Ran out of time. I didn't have money. In fact, I borrowed $5,000, and then we solicited funding from, just ordinary people. There were people that came and wanted to donate to the campaign that I didn't want any donations from, so we refused those. There were people who came and wanted to do other things for us, but they had ulterior motives. Everybody has an ulterior motive, but some, you see the writing on the wall, and I decided I didn't want to go that route. And Don and William were very protective of me because they wouldn't allow certain people to get to me. A lot of folks would go through them to try to get to me. They wouldn't allow that to happen. And what I learned out of the whole process is that people will do whatever it takes to control the Black community. And there's some complicity by Black folk, because at the end, after the election, I was in fact, the main focus of my platform was that I thought that we should be developing Black businesses in this town, and that Black businesses should have the opportunity to compete with anybody, with all the contracts that were being developed. Since the city is a predominantly Black city, 65%, and people still talk about 10% set asides, I thought that was ridiculous. I think that we should have at least 50% of all contracts. And of course, people disagree with that and saying that, well, Black businesses just can't do big jobs. And I would ask the question, well, how does white business get a chance to do the big jobs then? The reason is because they had an unfair advantage during the segregation era, and they took advantage of that. So there must be some creative ways that you can help develop the Black community to level that playing field. And without that, we're all being hypocritical. After the election was over, I was, the mayor wrote an article in the paper saying that I was a member of a cell of Black Republicans in town, and that we met on a regular basis. So I wrote a response to that. In fact, I called him at his home and asked him about it. And he said, well, Horace, that's what somebody told me. I said, well, Dick, you should have had the courtesy to at least ask me about it before you put it in the paper. He said, well, I'm sorry, and I will, he said he will make a statement about what I said in his next column. And he did. He said exactly what I had said to him. But then I wrote a response, because he was saying that my campaign was financed by white Republicans, and I get all kind of technical assistance from them. And now they tried to give me some assistance, but I wouldn't accept it. They of course didn't give me any money, and I was appalled, and I told the mayor that I was appalled because what you're saying is that all these black people that have worked so hard in my campaign, you're not giving them the credit, you're giving the credit to somebody exterior to us. And I want to know how in the world could you suggest that I'm a Republican, and I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat. But how do you suggest that I'm a Republican when I'm talking about affirmative action, not this 10% set aside, but really looking at the betterment of the community from a broader perspective. And in fact, I pointed out that my opponent received monies from about $30,000 from people who were in fact known Republicans. And these are monies that had been solicited by the coalition that the mayor is president of, well, I had been president of. And so I raised the question and said, well, it seemed to be rather peculiar that you would accuse me of being a Republican and receiving Republican money when everybody knows that